Well, we're beginning the second unit of this course now, and this is the unit where we'll do an overview of major world religions. Generally, this is the part of the course if students had any interest beyond just fulfilling a general education requirement to take this course. It's usually this section that they're most interested in. We're just going to spend a few sessions on each of 6 different major religious systems that you find in the world today. And so this is very much an introduction to those different religions. Each of the areas of religion that I'll be discussing over the next several sessions are topics that you can take full semester courses in our religious studies department here at Missouri State. So if after a few sessions of Hinduism and a film on Hinduism, if you still find that pretty interesting and you'd like to know more, then you can take a Hinduism course at the 300 level, the same with Buddhism or Islam or any of the others that I'll be covering in this next unit. So feel free to come back and pick up some of our other courses to build on what you begin here as far as a knowledge base about major world religions. Also in this unit, in addition to my lectures, as I mentioned in passing a minute ago, there will be some films over some of the different religions, and they are included as basically lectures in this series that you have. When there is a lecture time that it's a film, you should be able to go to your materials packet and find a study guide for each of the films. And you can complete that study guide as you watch the film. You do not need to turn the study guide into me. That's for you so that when the exam comes around over this unit, you'll know that that's the material to study for each of the films, and you don't have to sit there and recall everything from the film. So you can complete those guides as you watch each of the films that come up during this unit. As we begin this unit, I'm going to start with probably what is more a class of religions or a group, a loosely affiliated group of religions. Some religions that aren't as clearly delineated as, say, Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. We'll be looking at all those. But this is a class of religions that might not be so neat and tidy, but I'll talk about why we tend to group these religions together. So the title of these next few sessions is Indigenous Religions. Now, the word indigenous means pertaining to a certain area. Sometimes another word that you might hear used in a similar way that you use indigenous religions would be folk religions. That it's a spirituality, it's a body of spiritual understanding or religious practice that's unique to a particular area and often even to a particular group of people within a particular area. So, and this is a class of religions that generally when I'm teaching this in my regular classes, I draw a big umbrella on the board and I'll put indigenous religions and folk religions on that umbrella with still lots of room left on the umbrella. And I tell students, as I'll tell you right now, that on that umbrella we're going to put some more names up there. And these would all be names by which you could hear this class of religions called. So sometimes they're called indigenous, sometimes they're called folk, sometimes they're called one of the other 5 or 6 names that I'll give you as we talk about this. Sometimes this is a group of religions that's called primal religions. Not primitive, but primal in the sense of being rooted in the word prime, which means first. And so this class of religions that we're going to talk about are the first religions, or some of the oldest religions that you'll find. These are religious systems that their roots go back even further than Judaism or Hinduism to some, and even their roots are somewhat intertwined with early Hinduism and even with early Judaism. So sometimes they're called primal religions. Sometimes this class of religions is called oral religions. It's called oral as opposed to textual There are religions that we call textual religions and religions that we would call oral religions. Textual religions are religions that rely heavily upon a sacred text, that they're largely defined and rooted in a sacred text. If you're thinking along the line at all right now, you might be going, so maybe like Judaism or Christianity or Islam. Yeah, those would be textual religions because they are deeply intertwined with a sacred text and they're deeply rooted in a sacred text. And they tend to be transmitted through the passing on of understanding of that sacred text from generation to generation. But this class of religions that we're talking about are not textual, they're oral. It's the body of understanding, of teaching, of practice is passed down through oral tradition. The passing on of stories, the passing on of ritual, the passing on of explanations from generation to generation orally rather than textually. Now, at this point in my regular classes, I'll have this umbrella, and so I've got indigenous, folk, primal, oral on the umbrella for starters as different names that you might find for this class of religion. And then I ask students, so based on just what I've told you here, what are some religions that you would put under this umbrella? And, you know, most of them are pretty on it at this point. They've caught the wave. And so they'll say things like Native American religions, you know, the Eskimo religions, Aboriginal religions, voodoo, different kinds of witchcraft, or Wicca, or paganism, or neo-paganism, African tribal religions. All of those are religious expressions that you would find under this umbrella. And what we're going to look at here in a little bit are the characteristics that kind of wrap around all of those traditions that would put them under that umbrella together. But let me say a few more things about this, broadly about this class of religions before we start looking at some of the characteristics of religions that we could put under this umbrella in addition to the ones that I just mentioned to you. Typically, these types of religious expressions, they usually are in less technologically advanced areas, which that's probably what you would imagine. That they would be, you know, in the mountains of Australia somewhere, or in the bush of Africa somewhere, or in the tundra of northern Alaska somewhere. But that you would tend to find these in less technologically advanced cultures, and that's true. And the roots of them certainly are pre-technology by far. However, you do find these in more technologically advanced cultures. As a matter of fact, an interesting point is that these types of religious expressions are actually on the rise in more technologically advanced cultures. Now, again, if we could dialogue, I'd want us to talk about why you think that is. Why would these religions that are some of the oldest that there are, that are pre-technology, pre-science in their understanding of the world, why would they be on the rise in technologically advanced cultures like ours here in the U.S. or parts of South America or Australia or Europe? Why would they be on the rise? And I think you could find, we could come up with several things that we could talk about. I mean, for one thing, just the ability to get information, the access that we have to information at this culture, at this time. You know, when my great-grandmother, when she was in elementary school, if somebody mentioned paganism or Wicca or voodoo, and if she would have had any interest in that beyond what the teacher mentioned, how would she find that out? Well, she would have had to walk a long ways into the closest town that had a library, or wait till she could catch the horse and buggy that was heading that way to take her to the library, and then she'd have to find the right books that would have the right information about that, and somebody that worked there would have to probably guide her in that process. I mean, even if she had a tinge of curiosity back in her early years at the end of the 19th century, to fulfill that would have almost just been too much work to even pursue. But you sitting there today, if I mention Wicca or neo-paganism or Haitian voodoo as opposed to African voodoo, and you have a moment of curiosity, all you have to do is go to Google or go to ask.com or go to some search engine, type it in, and suddenly you have probably hundreds, if not thousands, of possibilities of ways you can get information about that. So we have easy access to information about these religions today, about these religious practices today that allow people to be much more informed about them. Not only do we have easy access to information, but there also tends to be easier access to the actual practitioners of those religions. It's quite likely if you typed in one of these religious expressions that somewhere along the way you would find a website where there was a button or a link that said contact us. And by tonight you could be in a dialogue by email with somebody that practices that religion. Again, that's not been possible in eras before. Even back when I was in college, that wouldn't have been possible. But that's possible today. So easy access to communications helps to put these on the rise in a culture like ours. The mobility of the world that we live in makes that possible. There's probably some of these that I've mentioned that you've seen. Even if they're in other parts of the world, maybe you've seen them. I mean, I've been to East Africa and seen Maasai ritual. I've been to Haiti and I've seen Haitian voodoo. I've been to South America and seen evidence of Santeria. You know, again, 50, 100 years ago, that kind of mobility and like actual physical access just wasn't possible or wasn't pragmatic for people, but it is today. And so because of the mobility of the world that we live in, there's more access to these, which puts them more on the rise. I think part of it, too, is just a general disillusionment with what we would call organized religion. The truth is, a lot of these systems, like we're going to be talking about, these indigenous, folk, primal, and other titles we'll give it, religions that we're going to talk about, are actually pretty complex systems. In many ways, more complex than religions that you're familiar with. And yet, on the other hand, they aren't institutional. They aren't so bureaucratic. There seems to be a little more room for some flexibility in them than what you find in a lot of the religion that most of us were raised with or were raised around. And so because of disillusionment with more bureaucratic, institutional religions, people are turning to these kinds of religious expressions as outlets for their spirituality, as a way to meet that need that we talked about earlier in the first unit, that need to be a part of some larger reality or some larger entity. One other thing I think that contributes to the growth of these types of religious expressions in technological cultures is kind of relates to the disillusionment that I just mentioned, but also just that a lot of these are kind of back to the earth, back to basics. They tend to be more environmentally, at least respectful and certainly aware. And so for people who are more interested in environmental concerns, or more interested in back to earth, simple things, then these types of religions are attractive because they're not about big fancy concrete buildings and they're not about big shopping malls, but they are about a lot of back to basics, back to the earth, back to some sort of unity with nature that we feel very alienated from in the more urban societies and culture that most of us live in today. So for those and a lot of other reasons, even though these are types of religious expressions that tend to be in less technologically advanced cultures, you find them, and you find them on the rise in technically advanced cultures like ours. One other thing that I would say is kind of a broad stroke about these religious practices and traditions is that they tend to last as long as they remain isolated in some way. I mean, these are some of the oldest religious expressions that there are. And for them to maintain a lot of that original nature that they had, they have to kind of be unattended or untouched by the more modern culture that we live in. But when that isolation from broader culture is lost, then you start to find these groups lose their uniqueness. And that isolation can be in a lot of ways. Sometimes that's an isolation that's a language isolation. Some of these groups that you might think of or that we may talk about are groups that they speak a dialect, that there may only be 800 or 1,000 of them in this tribe that they're a part of, and they speak a dialect that no one else in the world speaks. Well, unless somebody can come in and speak their dialect from an alternate worldview, life's probably going to keep going as it always has. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie The Gods Must Be Crazy. It was back in the 80s. There were 2 of those movies, but especially the first one, I think, it demonstrates a lot of what we're going to talk about in this session, actually. But in that movie, you've got that kind of a culture, a tribal culture that speaks a dialect that no one else in the world speaks. Life's been the way it has been, for thousands of years, but it's now the 1980s. And actually, their isolation is broken by a pilot in a small plane throwing a pop bottle out of the plane, and it lands in the middle of this tribe. And they've got glass and a glass container that they can put things in, and they can use it for a rolling pin, and then they start using it as a weapon to hit each other. And so this object that comes from outside their culture infiltrates their culture and begins to change the very nature of their culture. And even though it's kind of it's almost like a National Geographic spoof as far as what this movie's like, it's a great illustration of how, as long as these groups can remain isolated, they remain unchanged. But if someone who can speak their language, they break that isolation, it can change everything about that. Sometimes it's a geographical isolation. Some of these groups may be in an area on a mountain that just nobody ever goes to. They may be on a small island that nobody ever really goes to. I've even been in Haiti, which is just 700 miles off the coast of Florida, and I've been in some places in the mountains in Haiti where I was, and this would have been the late 80s, where I was told some of these people have never seen somebody that isn't a Haitian before. I mean, there's definitely a geographical isolation that they have there. Sometimes that isolation is a social isolation. That's what you tend to find more in cultures like ours. I mean, apparently there are several Wiccan groups or neo-pagan groups throughout the Ozarks. How many people know right offhand where any of those groups meet? Or the names of any of them, for that matter? Well, that's because they've chosen to maintain a social isolation. Now, they don't live off in communes. Most of these people that are practitioners in those groups are business people in the world with the rest of us. They're educators, they're housewives, they live in the neighborhood. But when it comes to living out this religious practice, they're more socially isolated because they don't want just anybody coming in and trying to bring their angle on things or trying to proselytize people or trying to correct them. They just want to be able to practice their religion privately, without interruption, without isolation being broken. And so as long as these groups maintain a certain amount of isolation, either language, geographical, social, they tend to remain unchanged. There's a woman that I've known for a while who is a Wiccan priestess here in the Ozarks. And it seems like about every time I talk to her, or every other time, she's in the process of or has just started forming a new group. And a lot of that is because they start forming a group and they have a certain amount of isolation that they're able to maintain, and the group functions well, but then that isolation starts to break down for various reasons. People bring some friends in or whatever the case might be. And as that isolation starts to break down, the group starts to lose its uniqueness, and eventually basically it falls apart because it's not unique anymore. It's been infiltrated by the values of the broader culture once again. But if it could remain socially isolated in what it does, then those groups might be able to perpetuate themselves. So these groups, you'll find them anywhere in the world. You'll find them here in the Ozarks, you'll find them throughout the United States, you'll find them in Africa, Alaska, South America, all over the world, you'll find these groups. But what binds, why would we put all these groups under this same umbrella? And there's really 4 primary characteristics that are shared by these groups that are what you could say are the things that bind them together under this umbrella. And first of those characteristics is that these groups tend to be monotheistic. They tend to focus on one supreme God or one supreme deity or one supreme energy or one supreme force. Now, it may not look that way, and we'll talk here in a moment about why it may not look that way. But the reality is that most of these groups have one ultimate divine reality. And that one ultimate divine reality is very authoritative. Whatever it, he, she says goes. Whatever it, he, she blesses or curses gets blessed and gets cursed. Whatever it wills happens. It's ultimate. It's authoritative. It's otios, which may be a new word for you. And otios is the idea that it's distant and unapproachable. That just any human doesn't have access to that deity, to that divine. As a matter of fact, in some cases, no human really has direct access with that divine, with that one supreme entity. It's otios, unapproachable and distant. But it has ways that it works its will in the world and in people's lives. So they tend to be monotheistic. But the second characteristic, which is why a lot of people think they're not monotheistic, is that they believe in spirits. By this worldview, the world and everything around is very much alive because spirits just infiltrate everything. And these spirits have more direct contact with humans, and humans have more direct contact with the spirits than with this deity, the divine, the one supreme God. When humans interact with the spiritual realm, they interact with the spirits. By and large, they don't interact with God, because God is otios, or that one supreme is otios, is distant, is unapproachable. And so they look polytheistic because there's all these different spirits that they're interacting with. But the spirits are more like intermediaries between the human realm and the divine realm. They are the liaisons. They are the go-between, between the human and the divine realm. There's a lot of these spirits, and they have access to them through a lot of places. One place is through deceased ancestors or deceased members of the tribe or the group. That the spirits of those members are still believed to be a part of the group or a part of the tribe. And to break any contact with them is a dangerous thing. I mean, these members of the tribe, these spirit members of the group, they're really, in many ways, more valuable to the group than the living members are. Because they have access to the spirit realm. Without them, how would the living members have access to the spirit realm? So they're seen as vital. I mean, that's a lot of the reason why, as the U.S. expanded westward and began going into Native American territories, even when we would offer land exchanges to the Native Americans, where it looked like, as far as land goes, they might have been getting the better end of the deal, they weren't interested in leaving behind the land that they had, because there were burial grounds on that land. And the belief is that the spirits of those deceased tribal members stayed in the area where their bodies were buried. And so to pack up and move somewhere else would be a desertion of maybe some of the most important members of the tribe. So they weren't interested in leaving those members behind. They wanted to maintain contact with them. And these ancestors are still very involved in the tribe. When I think about the role of these ancestor spirits, I think about a group of people that are in a chain of islands called the Trobriand Islands. And they're called the Trobrianders by those outside trying to look in and understand what goes on there. And some anthropologists have gone in and over the last 20, 30 years done different work there among the Trobrianders to try to understand that culture. And as they've done that, you really see this role of the spirits of deceased tribal members as being so vital to what goes on in that tribe. I mean, the main tribe is on a particular island in this Trobriand island chain. And there's another island that's within visual distance. It's a smaller island, but it's in visual distance from the main island. And what Trobrianders believe is that when someone dies, that their spirits go and they live on this other island. So obviously that island's very sacred. You don't go touch that island. That could be life or death to do that. It's taboo to do that because there's so much power in that island. And so those spiritual ancestors are over there. And what people on this main island believe is that whatever goes on here revolves around that island where the spirits live. Whatever happens here. I mean, their main, it's an agrarian society, and their main crop is sweet potatoes. Every year when they have the sweet potato harvest, who do they owe gratitude to for the sweet potato harvest? Spirits. As a matter of fact, they have a several-day, basically a Thanksgiving-type ceremony. Part of that is initially doing chants and dances on the beach to invite these spirits to come over. When they come over, there's a place on the shore that's marked off where the spirits can park their canoes. There's a seating area where they can watch all the festivities of gratitude for the sweet potato harvest. There's a table with a feast laid out for these spirits. And they believe that they come and that they are able to be shown gratitude by coming. Now, you could have the sweet potato festival and have all this stuff happen, and then when it's all said and done, the food is still on the banquet table. You never saw the waters part when the canoes came and went. You never noticed like any trash left behind in the seating area where the spirit's supposed to be seated. And so people could start to go, well, you think that really happens? You think they really come? Well, even if there is doubt like that, are they going to quit having the sweet potato harvest? Probably not. Because to break contact with that spiritual realm would be a dangerous thing. And if they decided, we don't really think that's all real. We're just going to keep doing our sweet potato thing and forget about those spirits. There would be great fear that next year when it came sweet potato harvest time. I mean, what if they didn't get a harvest? If that's all they had to eat on for the whole year? If there were spirits and they were offended, they're on a track of starvation now. And so they want to maintain contact with that spirit realm because, again, to break that would be a risk. They believe that women, when they are in the waters off the beach toward that island, that they are actually impregnated by those spirits in the water. When they're bathing, when they're doing laundry, or sometimes they just go in the water because they want to have more children. Now, as anthropologists have broken some of that isolation through learning the language and have been able to talk with some of the tribal people, a lot of them recognize that there does seem to be some connection between certain physical behaviors between men and women and children resulting. But there aren't children every time every man and woman has intercourse. So, that leaves that up to doubt in their minds. That even though we could explain scientifically, we don't think your babies come from the spirits, we think that they come from you having intercourse. They would say, but not every time we have intercourse, we don't always have babies. But there's nothing really to disprove that the spirits aren't impregnating those women. And so they, again, even though there's kind of this understanding that there may be more involved than just the spirits impregnating the women, they don't let go of that. Because what if they quit giving the spirits credit? And they ended up offending spirits that were, in fact, real. There's too much of a risk involved in that. So there's a lot of interaction with the spirits of deceased ancestors, and breaking any contact with those spirits is a risky thing. And I'll show you some examples of that from Haitian voodoo here in a little bit. A third characteristic that you find of these types of religions that we would put under this umbrella is that they tend to be animistic. Animism is the belief that there's a spiritual quality to all of life, or that all of life has a spirit in it. And so not only do people have a spirit, but animals have spirits in them. Trees, rocks, rivers, the sun, the moon, mountains, that there are spirits in these. And so in these animistic religions, it's important to revere all things in nature, because there's a spirit quality in nature just as much as there's a spirit quality in me or in you. And so again, that can be in animals, it can be in objects. I mentioned back in one of the earlier lectures about the possibility of evil spirits inhabiting coins or objects of value from a Haitian voodoo worldview. That's an animistic worldview, that spirits can inhabit those types of things. There's a belief that Again, spirits can be in all of nature. And so there's a great reverence for nature because of that. Each of these objects, animals, people, things in nature that possess a spirit are also believed to possess something called manna or mana. And it's not like what you find in the Hebrew Bible that's spelled M-A-N-N-A, but this is with one N, mana. And what this is it's an impersonal power that inhabits things that have spirits. And so, you know, I might have a spirit in me, you might have a spirit in you, my dog might have a spirit, Table Rock Lake might have a spirit in it. But each of those spirits have different amounts of mana or different amounts of power in them. Each person's spirit has different levels of power in them, some more spiritual power than others. And so this is an impersonal power that collects in people and in things. And the more that this power is perceived to collect in people and in things, then the more sacred those people or those objects become. I always relate this a little bit to a phenomenon that I think you can find in our culture. And I think it's particularly a phenomenon that you often find among athletes in our culture. Again, in my classes, I always ask, how many of you have been or are athletes? And you know, several students will raise their hands. And then I'll ask, how many of you, either you personally or someone on a team that you were on, or maybe your team as a whole, had certain rituals that were kind of like your lucky rituals, or certain objects that were your lucky objects, certain things that you said or certain songs that you sang that you believed those brought luck to you? Well, just about all of them raised their hands, because if you've been involved in athletics, you know that there's some superstition involved in all that as well. And so I'll have students talk about that. And what you see as they tell the stories is that there's some person or object or ritual or song or chant that just kind of starts out, often as a fluke. But then it seems that something good comes from that. And so they start to go, maybe there's some power in that. And so they draw from that the next time around. And it seems to work again. And so there seems to be there's more power in that. And over time, whatever that is comes to be believed to possess a lot of power. One of my favorite stories is from a student that would play baseball in high school. And he told a story in class about how his high school baseball team, his senior year, started out the year bad. They lost every game, and most of them they lost terribly. And so they were at this game one day, and they were doing their warm-up on the field before the game. And some of the outfielders found a dead squirrel out there in the outfield. And so they're out there warming up, and they're kicking this dead squirrel around, and squirreling around a little bit. And so then they play this game, and they won the game. So to what did that team credit the win? The dead squirrel. That was the thing that was different that day than anything else. And so they decided maybe it's a dead squirrel. So they put the dead squirrel in a bag and they took it with them. They took it to the next game. They won. Took it to the next game. They won. The squirrel started stinking, so they put it in a jar. Kept taking it to all these games. They went through the whole season. They won every game and won the state championship. How sacred was that squirrel by the end of that ball season? It was very sacred. I mean, it went from kicking the thing around in the outfield to setting it in a sacred position in a jar in the dugout and having a sacred burial for it when the season was all over, because it's a sacred, dead, decomposing squirrel at this point. Well, it's the same sort of thing that's here. You know, there's a woman next door in the village, and you got a sick kid, and you go to her, and she says, you know, put a clove of garlic around the child's neck and say this little chant. And so you do, and your kid gets better. Well, then your sister's child gets sick. You say, hey, you should go to my neighbor. You know, I think what she did helped my child. And so she goes, and she tells your sister something to do, and it works. Well, then over time, everybody starts going to this woman. Well, she's gone from just the little neighbor woman in the hut next door to probably a great spiritual teacher, or at least a great spiritual medicine woman in the village. Because with every one of these incidents, it has confirmed the spiritual power that must exist in her. That's this idea of mana that exists in things. And related to that, typically within a tribe, there's a person that possesses a great amount of this spiritual power. And those people are called shamans. People perceived to have the most spiritual power compared to others in the tribe. Shamans are often thought to be people that have in some way entered into and know how to walk around in the spiritual realm in a way that nobody else does. But they are the most spiritual of these tribes. The fourth characteristic that you tend to find among these groups is that they believe in and practice magic. Now, this isn't a magic like the magic shows that we go to where people levitate or whatever they do, but rather magic is a means of communication within these groups. It's a way to communicate with the spirit realm. It's a way to coerce the spirit realm. It's a way to ask things of the spirit realm, or it's a way to thank the spirit realm for things. So it's a means of communication with the spirit realm. Sometimes that's to receive blessings. I mean, why did Native Americans do rain dances? Those were magical rituals, those rain dances. Well, they believed that if they danced hard enough and long enough and painted their faces enough, that the spirit realm would respond and give them rain. Why did they do these great elaborate dances before their buffalo hunts back in the 18th, 19th centuries, and probably before that? Well, they believed that if they danced long enough and hard enough and painted their faces enough, that the spirit of the buffalo would respond, provide what they needed for food for the winter. That they do these magical rituals to try to gain blessing from the spirit realm. They also do these magical rituals to try to gain revelations from the spirit realm. Sometimes that's how they gain guidance if they don't know what to do. I think of a scene or a part in the movie from now, it's 15, 20 years old, probably 20 years old, of Dances with Wolves. And in that movie, there's this Native American tribe that has to make a decision about what they're going to do about a situation. And so they all gather in the teepee of one of the holy men, shamans of the tribe. And they sit around in a circle in this teepee. Now, whether you've seen the movie or not, you could speculate what happens next, probably. They're all sitting around this circle. They're here to try to figure out what to do about a situation. What's the first thing they do? Well, somebody pulls out a pipe, and they put some sort of tobacco in the pipe, and they light it, and they begin passing that around, and people taking draws from that pipe. And they pass it around again. They pass it around again. And eventually, they come to some discernment about what they as a tribe should do about the situation. Passing around that pipe was seen to be the magical ritual that enabled that to happen. Now, what was in the pipe? Probably something hallucinogenic, most likely. Peyote, marijuana, something. Which they would acknowledge. They don't deny that. But they believe that if you just try to gain discernment with just our day in and day out way of thinking, we're blocked in that. And so what smoking that pipe does with certain kinds of tobacco that they found, it opens up their minds to a spirit realm where they can comprehend things from that spirit realm in ways that they couldn't just day in and day out. And so that magical ritual brings them a revelation, brings them guidance from the spirit realm. The shaman, again, plays a major role here because the shaman carries out these magical rituals or knows what ones to carry out. Now, with these characteristics I've just mentioned to you, we can put some more titles for this class of religions on that umbrella. Sometimes they're called shamanistic because of the role of the shaman in these groups. They don't have a sacred text, but it's often the shaman that's like the final authority in what should happen. Sometimes they're called spiritist religions because of the role of spirits that we talked about earlier. Sometimes these religions are called animist or animistic religions because of how much they believe that the spirit quality is in all parts of life. Sometimes they're called nature religions or earth religions because they believe there's a spirit in all things in nature. There's a reverence, almost it would appear to be a worship even of nature or of the earth that's there, because they believe there's a spirit quality about it. And so sometimes they're called earth religions or nature religions. There are many titles that you find for this group of religions. Let me just mention quickly two things that these religions tend not to have. They don't tend to have sacred writings, which you mentioned earlier. They're not textual by and large. And they don't tend to have an organized system of thought. Again, they don't have sacred writings. They don't have a text. They don't have a text that unifies the group. Certainly you could take something like Wicca or neo-paganism here in the 21st century. And you would find people within Wicca or neo-paganism that would have certain books that they might consider sacred. But if you had a gathering of all the Wiccans or all the neo-pagans, there would not be one text around which they all would revolve their understanding of life. Now, if you got a bunch of Christians together, there'd be one text. A bunch of Muslims, there'd be one text. A bunch of Jews, there'd be one text. But you won't find that with these groups. So even if they are a literate culture, there still doesn't tend to be a unifying text. So they lack sacred writings. They lack an organized system of thought. It doesn't really matter in these religions whether a practice or belief makes sense or not. It doesn't really matter whether a practice or belief excludes another practice or belief, or would even seem to be in opposition. It doesn't really matter. What matters in these groups is what works, what's pragmatic. And if it works to heal your children or get you sweet potatoes or bring a curse on a vengeful neighbor to do something, then they do it. There doesn't have to be a rationale behind it. There doesn't have to be a systematic theology behind it. It doesn't have to make sense. It's just, does it work? So they're very pragmatic in their understanding. I want us to look at a particular type of these religions, and so we're going to do that in the next session so we can wrap up this session of note-taking.